After returning to the White House in 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump once again played the tariff card. He imposed high tariffs across a wide range of products on countries around the world, including Southeast Asia. His policies sent shockwaves through global technology industries and supply chains. And at Trump's so-called Liberation Day press conference, Trump even singled out Vietnam specifically, an ASEAN member. Take a look.
The United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations. Vietnam, they charge us 90%. We're going to charge them 46% tariff.
As one of the world's most dynamic regions, how is Southeast Asian economies dealing with this new reality? And how are ASEAN countries enhancing their economic resilience and managing reliance on any single market through their supply chain diversification and industrial policies? And where does Taiwan fit into all this, among all these Southeast Asian regional adjustments? Hello, and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I am Wen T. Song, your host for today. To discuss these issues and more, I am joined by two very distinguished guests today. First, we have Christy Xu Dunci, Chonghua Institution for Economic Research, ASEAN Studies Center Director. Then we also have Professor Andrew Kam Jia Yi, National University of Malaysia Principal Research Fellow and Professor. A very warm welcome to you both. After months of negotiation, the additional tariff that the Trump administration imposed on Southeast Asian economies have mostly settled at around 20%, through rates for Myanmar and Laos specifically remain above 40%. In negotiation with Southeast Asian countries, the Trump administration has demanded improvements in trade imbalances with the U.S. U.S. has also pressed Southeast Asian governments to crack down on transshipment and origin laundering practices, enforce stricter issuance of certificates of origin, revise and tighten rules of origin, and finally reduce imports of industrial products, particularly from China. So, Christy, I want to come to you for our first question.
Yes.
This tariff war going on, Trump administration seems to have a new posture. I'm wondering what's your general assessment here at the broader strategy level? What seems to be the U.S. and Trump 2.0 specifically? What's U.S. ASEAN policy at this moment, especially when it comes to changes and continuities, if there's any in area like trade, supply chain, export controls? What's your general assessment?
Well, that is really a very good question because I think a lot of people would like to know the answer. I think my friend Andrew will agree with me that most people think that Trump has no so far ASEAN policy or in those specific policy because his priority is more about trade balance, more about economic gains, and therefore under his transactional approach, and he is dealing with all countries that he thinks he could achieve his objective. Having said that, I think there are a number of noticeable changes in the past few months. One of the most recent one is that Trump's return to the ASEAN summit. After 8 years, when he attended the ASEAN summit in 2017. And though his presence at the ASEAN summit in Malaysia overshadowed ASEAN's role. And you may ask, does this mean that Trump is thinking that ASEAN is very important? I think the answer is not, because the main reason for his return to ASEAN summit, and one is he is the one that he thinks is making a dealing to have this peace deal between Cambodia and Thailand. And therefore, he has to be there to witness the signing ceremony and frame it as a U.S. diplomatic achievement. The second is to improve and witness U.S. influence in terms of achieving all these trade deal, critical mineral deals with several ASEAN members. And therefore, he is there for all this reason. Doesn't mean that he is having a different ASEAN policy or that he is treating ASEAN more differently compared with his first term or other countries.
Right, so still sounds like a lot of bilateralist transactions focused here, and a multilateral region-wide strategy seem to be perhaps a work in progress. All right, I want to ask Andrew, we talk about U.S. posture. I'm wondering what's the other side of the coin, what's the ASEAN posture like? So in the face of Trump's trade policy and global economic shifts, How do you think ASEAN is adjusting its macroeconomic policies and investment strategies so that it can maintain its growth and vitality and attract foreign investments?
I think ASEAN has always been ASEAN, doing it the ASEAN way. When Liberation Day was being announced, many of the countries put our stance, our neutrality stance, to gain confidence or give confidence to the investors. So it has always been a neutral stance, and that will open up opportunities from both sides. But having said that, apart from putting our position, neutral position, we also strengthen our domestic industries by engaging in industrial upgrading activities and also technology, acquisition, and also focus on key industries that are important. Amid all this uncertainty, and then of course ASEAN do not do it alone. We have this organization. We have enough tools to actually buffer some of the challenges. You talk about the recently signed ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement version 3, and also we have other ASEAN Plus and also RCEP at our disposal. So there are ways to actually navigate all these uncertainty and challenges coming from Trump.
Right, so it sounds like ASEAN way remains closest thing to a principle-based position that can keep the team cohesion together for the region and hopefully provide some buffer, as you said.
Yeah.
I want to come to you next, Christy.
Yes.
I think the extension of that question about ASEAN responses against this broader backdrop of U.S.-China rivalry in economic and other realms, of course, that has meant global supply chain restructuring in a big way. And how are ASEAN countries managing their trade dependence on single markets so that they can find ways to, put eggs in more basket at this juncture?
Yes, when you mention how can ASEAN reduce its dependence on a single market, I think this refers to both China as well as the U.S., right? Because right now, U.S. has become the largest market and largest source of trade with a number of ASEAN member economies. So I think this can be explained by the ASEAN's economic performance last year, because the Asia Development Bank just released its latest assessment and demonstrating that most ASEAN member states in 2025 actually have better than expected economic performance. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam actually have higher growth rate than expected. I think this can be attributed to ASEAN governments as well as industry's effort in the beginning last year to try to diversify their market. And with regards to government-driven initiative, following the RCEP and also the ASEAN Plus One FTA, ASEAN right now collectively or individually are engaging more with other countries in terms of either trade agreement or other collaboration. For example, under Prime Minister Anwar's leadership, ASEAN right now is discussing FTA with GCC, the Gulf countries, and also it's working a lot with Africa and also other countries. So I think ASEAN understand that they have to diversify, not to overly dependent on both China and also on US, and therefore there have been a lot of initiatives going on.
All right, that's interesting. So 2025 was a good year economically for Southeast Asia, even amidst all this uncertainty that's been created.
Better than everyone expected.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And that note about, expansion to work with other regions, be it Gulf area, be it African economy, seems to be an important way out as well for them. Andrew, I want to ask you about, one other elephant in the room here when it comes to, of course, Southeast Asia. We talked about U.S. as a major extra-regional power. The other extra-regional power of import, of course, is China. So I'm wondering what's your take on how China has been engaging Southeast Asia, at least economically, on key industries. How is China managing its trade tension here with U.S. When it comes to Southeast Asia?
I think China remains deeply engaged through investment, infrastructure, technology partnerships, and also demand for intermediate good. At the same time, it is also adjusting by localizing parts of its supply chain in Southeast Asia, especially in the electronics and material, as a way to manage trade tensions while maintaining regional integration. Importantly, I think economic relations remain strong and stable with ASEAN countries, reinforced by, as mentioned just now, the upgrade of the ASEAN-China FTA version 3.0 last year, which focuses on key sectors, like the digital economy, green economy, supply chain connectivity, customs, and moving beyond the traditional goods trade. I think it suggests that at economic level there are relatively few structural frictions, despite the broader geopolitical tensions.
Interesting. All right. So ASEAN-China FTA 3.0 last year you talked about. So it sounds like China is definitely still finding Southeast Asia to be a major player, a major partner to work with economically. And I definitely find it interesting when you talk about how there's few structural barriers to further cooperation between China and Southeast Asia. Because people used to talk about perhaps with China economically become more, moving out of the value chain, perhaps there will be some competition, but it sounds like they're still managing it. All right, so moving on, I think during the 47th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur last year, President Trump concluded a series of economic, trade, and critical minerals cooperation agreements with Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. The initiative focused on lowering tariff and other non-tariff barriers, expanding market access for U.S. goods, and at a time when China is tightening control on rare earths, also diversifying supplies of minerals essential for semiconductors, EVs, and the defense industry. So I think I want to come to Christy on this issue of semiconductors. I think that, of course, we've seen that U.S. has placed a lot of special consideration and emphasis on semiconductor, building better, more autonomous capacity for semiconductor chip production in U.S. and so on and so forth. And I know ASEAN has been talking about finding a way to accelerate their own semiconductor presence as well. There was a framework that's been announced called the ASEAN Integrated Semiconductor Supply Chain Framework, which talk about technology standards and talent development and other things. So if I may ask you, how robust do you think ASEAN's policy framework is on semiconductor and other technology-intensive areas at this juncture?
I think that framework is one of the efforts, again, led by Malaysia to try to integrate different member states' supply chain parts so that they can be a more integrated ecosystem within ASEAN member state. And based on the framework delivered last year, and then the Philippines, the host of ASEAN this year, 2026, is going to turn that framework into action plan. So we can expect more policy and measures will be coming out from different member states and also from ASEAN collectively. So ASEAN as a new or a rising region for semiconductor has already been witnessed because it has Singapore, it has Malaysia, which has developed semiconductor certain parts for over 50, 60 years. And right now with newcomers, Indonesia is very active with its raw materials, and also Philippines has also fundamentals, and Vietnam is also very interesting and also very active. Therefore, for Taiwan's perspective, in the past 2-3 years, we're already seeing some Taiwanese company, including the UMC, Taiwan's second largest chip maker, going to Singapore and announce the expansion of fabrication. Also, another company going to Singapore, and several other companies going to Malaysia and also going to Vietnam for testing and packaging. And therefore, Taiwanese companies are interested because an ASEAN can prove to be a new region where semiconductor supply chain, including design, fabrication, and also testing and packaging, can be all integrated into this region.
Right, so it sounds like an old stage of the whole industry sector that seems to be on the rise in Southeast Asia. I actually might ask Andrew for the same question as well when it comes to semiconductor sector in Southeast Asia. I know that there's been a lot of buzz about Singapore and Malaysia getting new investment when it comes to building semiconductors. So maybe just your take as well on how do you assess the semiconductor industry's growth in ASEAN?
I will say that it is not about the framework. I mean, it's good to have framework, but the problem is always on the implementation. This is just to build on what Christy has mentioned just now. Yes, we have identified all the niches, assembly, testing, packaging. However, how are we going to execute the plans, knowing that knowledge sharing and technology constitute a huge part of a comparative advantage of companies, and also with razor-thin margins, how will this framework be somewhat, applied, or the action plans be done, that has left to be known. That is one thing. I think instead of viewing that any framework or blueprint as a silver bullet for technological gap, market gap, or talent gap, I think all these frameworks that that have been created are best viewed as facilitator to market access. Example like you mentioned just now, help to harmonize trade and investment standards, streamlining process of non-tariff measures, and now in wake of increasing ESG requirements, the setting of common sustainability goals, will be some of the actions that can be created.
Nice. So devil is in the detail. It sounds like harmonizing thinking and framework is important, and then it's up to the actual implementation to see how far and how deeply you go. So thanks for that, Andrew. I want to turn back to Christy. So how do you assess Taiwan's critical role in the semiconductor and chip industry can fit into ASEAN's plan here when it comes to supply chain reshuffling, especially in foundry, chip design support? How is it a player here in Southeast Asia as regional cooperation?
Yes, Taiwan's position in semiconductor supply chain have been recognized by over the world. And actually during the past 2-3 years, and we as a think tank has been receiving delegations from various ASEAN member states. Each one invites Taiwan to a TSMC, for example, to go to their country to set up replication. And therefore, we do know that ASEAN countries are very interested. However, currently there are a number of investment projects already going on, but mostly focusing on mature chips fabrication and also test and packaging, and also in certain countries like in Vietnam and also in the Philippines, focus more on IC design. And therefore, for most Taiwanese company, they have already invested according to the condition, also the market demands in different ASEAN countries. But as for more advanced chip making, so far TSMC and also other company focusing more in United States and probably in Japan in the future. And therefore, I think it's more feasible for Taiwan and ASEAN member states to talk more about fabrication for what they really need. Chips for automobile, chips for electronic consumer products, and also another area is talent development, because Vietnam, Philippines are talking with Taiwan to help cultivate and train their talents, because all these countries, they have abundant human resources, and also especially for their young talents. But currently they need Taiwan, for example, to help training these talents to become workforce, important workforce in semiconductor supply chain in their countries.
Thank you for that. So, all right. So, technology industry also has a human component as well, and Taiwan is an important player there, yes. I'm sure. So, we talked about ASEAN Summit earlier about it being an important platform, and one other thing that was mentioned at the 2025 ASEAN Summit was that U.S. President Trump signed a number of key mineral cooperation agreement with Malaysia and Thailand, and that show that U.S. is interested in exploring the area, including on rare earths. So maybe I'll ask Andrew on this question. How is ASEAN viewing this agreement when it comes to working on critical minerals with U.S. and perhaps other players here, and what does it mean for longer-term supply chain integrity?
ASEAN generally sees this agreement as economic opportunity rather than purely strategic alignments. In the short term, I believe, or ASEAN believe, that they bring investment, processing capacity, and market access. Over the long term, they can improve supply chain resilience, because now you have another option, another market, which is US. Of course, all these things come with a caveat, provided that ASEAN countries retain policy space, environmental safeguard, and also a diversified market export strategy. Some countries, like Malaysia, there are internal debates on whether the deal is balanced or not. However, the issue has really been addressed by the government. Long-term impact, I think most ASEAN economies are more concerned about the environmental risk, governance capacity, and of course, more importantly, the distribution of economic wealth rather than geopolitics. Also from a policy perspective, competition should be welcomed, as it accelerates innovation and reinforces value chain resilience.
Thank you for that answer. So I think next topic here, I think in response to the new economic challenges and supply chain resilience and restructuring processes, ASEAN countries have been actively enhancing their overall competitiveness and advancing green energy development. At the opening ceremony of the October ASEAN Summit, Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, serving as 2025 rotating chair of ASEAN, had this to say.
We are also advancing the ASEAN power grid. The new APG financing facility will help bridge funding gaps and accelerate our transition towards cleaner, more secure energy. In parallel, we are moving forward on the ASEAN Blue Economy Framework and the regional electric vehicle ecosystem, building the foundations of sustainable industry and green growth. With ASEAN's digital economy expected to double to $2 trillion by 2030.
So renewables are definitely an important industry to watch here, but we know, of course, there will always be challenges when it comes to financing, when it comes to infrastructure limitations, as well as regulatory challenges to be harmonized and to be perhaps managed. So I think I'll ask Christy this question. This is sort of a broader ESG topic here in this sense, but how do you think ASEAN governments have been going about crafting concrete green energy investment and energy transition strategies here, and how are they balancing between economic growth and sustainability?
I think since the past 2 years, ASEAN's focus industry have been shifting from manufacturing to AI to green transition, all these things. Because when you talk about this strategic autonomy and you talk about this rising, this future industry, and ASEAN has to depend on themselves, not to depend overly on either China or any other major economy. And therefore, there being a lot of discussion, including collectively under ASEAN, there have been a number of programs and also initiatives. However, having said that, as far as I know, each different member state also have their own policy. And in that regard, Taiwan has been cooperating with some of these countries. For example, Taiwan has been in the Philippines working and also investing in renewable energy sector, including wind and also wind power and also other things. And also in Vietnam, Taiwan is also invited to invest there, because if you have this green transition and including green power, for example, is very, very important for all manufacturing industry. And therefore, Taiwan right now is very keen in cooperating with this country in the renewables sector.
Thank you. Those are important, I think, facts to get across to our audience for sure. And I think that connects very nicely to my next question. I think I'll go to Andrew for the next one. And if this were academic seminar, we'll call this the prescription or policy recommendation portion of the talk, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, Taiwan, just wondering, Andrew, what kind of opportunity do you think Taiwan can provide to Southeast Asia to make itself a valuable partner, one that complements and is effective as a partner to Southeast Asian?
I think first thing first, Taiwan can be a model, because a lot of Southeast Asia, let's say the producers, they need some convincing, that green energy, is a business model and a catalyst for economic competitiveness. not just climate policy. Renewable deployment, is actually tied to lowering, industrial energy costs, attracting green FDI, and keep ASEAN supply chain, relevant as carbon rules tightens globally. Many miss the point, thinking that environmental, initiatives, are just something that is policing, the processing. However, environmental initiatives actually forces process improvement, cleaner production, and smarter technology, thus creates new job opportunities and also increase productivity. And also, I think Taiwan has very good data, for research, and I think a lot of countries can actually, benefit and actually learn on the, data collection process that Taiwan can actually offer. And other than that, I think, financial issues, apart from green economy, we can also learn from Taiwan, when it comes to sustainability, in areas of blue economy, and also orange economy as well, when it comes to media and cultural. So there are a lot of things that we can actually learn from Taiwan. Yeah.
So that's all the time we have for our show. And I would like to thank our two very distinguished guests today, Christy and Andrew, for so generously sharing your time and expertise with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.